focus for this particular assignment is to look at the end of Reconstruction. Make sure you are familiar with these terms here and that you are using the primary source document sheet. For this particular class, we are going to analyze some sources. You need to work in teams of 5. There are 2 lengthy readings. If there's time, we'll then look at segregation laws to develop loopholes for the plaintiff. Remember, we want to treat highlighted items like definitions. We've already addressed the 1876 election and the compromise, which put the South into military districts to ensure that the 13th through 15th Amendments were being followed. And with this particular agreement, all of these military districts were removed, and the end result was going to be the establishment of home rule, because the former Confederacy can address the race problem and solve it how they see fit without intervention from the federal government, which is why you're going to see a series of poll tax, literacy tests, grandfather clauses to act as loopholes around the 15th Amendment. This is going to be violence as well as those loopholes, and this will eventually lead to the Jim Crow segregation laws that would eventually be reversed with the Brown versus Board of Ed decision, part of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. The first source we're going to analyze is this Supreme Court ruling of Plessy-Ferguson. All students are required to read the first 2, and then you're going to split up the reading among the 5 students in the group. Keep in mind, if you do not recall this particular incident, Plessy is boarding this particular cart. He is told by the state law and the enforcing officer that he has to sit in the cart that is the cart for his race. And the loophole here is that they're not saying he cannot get from point A to point B. He still gets to his destination. The only thing they're saying is you have to sit in the right cart. This particular case is going to be determined in the courts to figure out if anybody's rights were violated and where to go with regard to this particular law. Everybody is required to read this particular slide, because this slide gives you the summary of events as far as what is going on. As it mentions here, the petitioner was a citizen of the U.S. and a resident of the state of Louisiana of mixed descent, and the proportion of 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African. That mixture of colored blood was not discernible in him, and he was entitled to every recognition, right, privilege, and immunity secured to citizens of the U.S. of the white race. So this is going to outline the scenario. The assignment in the team of 5 is to complete the reading and then determine what evidence is being used that will eventually lead to the Supreme Court ruling. This section provides a brief summary. As we get to this section, this really acts as the only piece of evidence for this particular slide. In this section, we see some more background information. In this area here, we see the reference to the law. Keep in mind that this is a state law, and it is arguing that railway companies carrying passengers in their coach in the state shall provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races. Again, they're not saying that you cannot get from point A to point B. All they're saying in this law is you need to sit in the correct cart that is designated for your race. In this section, it looks at the officer. Keep in mind that somebody has to enforce these laws, and in this case, it is going to be the officer in question here. In this section, we see an additional reference to the law as written, and in this particular third section, it basically is telling employees of the railway companies that they have to comply with the act, which means even if you do not agree with this piece of legislation, you are still required by an employee of the railway company to make sure that this law is followed. The last thing I guess you would want is to have somebody of the opposite race sit next to someone on their trip to wherever it is that they're going. In this section, it looks at the issue of race. As they mention here, the mixture of colored blood and they're trying to argue that is not physically visible, and that seems to be the issue here. What is the race of the person violating this particular law? Now on this slide, they're looking primarily at the 13th Amendment, and they're trying to figure out whether or not the incident in question here is a violation of the 13th Amendment. Keep in mind that this one is about slavery, and this case seems to have nothing to do with that particular issue, but they are referencing the 13th Amendment, and they are bringing up additional cases which involve possibly servitude. So they're debating the word servitude. And then when you get down here where you look at some of the civil rights cases, it talks about the owner of an inn, public conveyance, public place of amusement, refusing accommodations to colored people cannot be justly regarded as imposing any badge of slavery. So here they're looking at the 13th Amendment, but they're trying to determine whether or not there's any servitude that is taking place as a result of this case. On this slide, they're trying to figure out whether or not the 14th Amendment was violated. They bring up prior cases here. And for the most part, what they're trying to do in this section here is look at citizenship. The naturalized born citizen of the United States. Is there a difference between a state citizen and a federal citizen, or I guess just a citizen in general? That seems to be the issue that they're discussing here. And then they bring up the issue of race, where they're arguing that having these separate carts does not have anything to do with establishing inferiority between one race and another, and the evidence they use is looking at separate schools. The end result is going to be the federal support for segregation laws, and from this point forward you'll start to see a series of local and state laws that maintain the separation of the races. The task here is to look at the two images which are required and determine if the services provided are equal. With the Plessy-Ferguson court case decision, we will see federal government support for segregation laws. The next section and document is going to be about fear, and then we'll finish up with an analysis of segregation law. A little bit of background information prior to analyzing the source. Here's currently where we're at. We have a series of Jim Crow laws. There's been local, state versus federal tension, but that federal tension has been reduced with regard to the outcome of the Plessy-Ferguson court case decision. African American scholars would look at this period as the darkest period in African American studies. Why? Because home rule has been established, and the next thing is going to be instilling fear and the thought process of the freed slave. As we transition to the practice of lynching, we see some statistics here. Ida B. Wells, a lobbyist trying to get a lynching bill passed. And then of course we have some images of the horrific incident, which seemed to be a public spectacle where people would gather to view these murders. In 2018, a lynching memorial was opened. These were renderings prior to that open date. Strange fruit is a reference to the practice of lynching, and it's looking at comparing the dangling of fruit to the dangling of a black body, as it mentions right here, swinging in the summer breeze. We've already established that Ida B. Wells was working to establish some sort of lynching bill. Here she is in this image working with Dyer from Missouri. The important section of the lynching bill is here, and if there's any state or government subdivision fails, neglects, or refuses to provide and maintain protection to the life of any person within its jurisdiction against the mob. Let's just say that this individual was arrested for whatever crime. The town thinks it's a horrific crime, and they decide that they are going to implement mob justice by going to the jail, pulling this individual out, and then killing him. This would hold the police officer accountable because the police officer represents the institutions that they're mentioning here. This is going to put federal pressure on the state governments to end this particular practice. However, it does not get passed. We're going to transition to source 2. And these are the issues that you want to focus on. In this source, we get a little background information on the emancipation of the Negro and the consequence where Negro bodies were lost. Ultimately, this source is going to be about the killing of African Americans. The source here is pretty self-explanatory, as it's looking at some of the events that have occurred, and ultimately what we're looking at here is the value of African American life. It mentions here, giving you a time frame with the amount of people murdered, and then the excuses that were being used to justify those killings. So far we have a series of events that acts as evidence for the killing of African Americans, and this section right here, the government which had made the Negro a citizen found itself unable to protect him, which was the whole point of the military districts that were put in place to make sure that the 13th through 15th Amendment were being followed. Which goes on to talk about some of the incidents that have occurred, and ultimately there seems to be limited protection for the freed slave. In this section, Ida B. Wells indirectly references home rule that we have been talking about and looks at the amount of suffering up until this particular point that has been encountered by this particular group. To recap the 3 issues so far, we have the federal support for separate but equal. We just finished the section on fear, and now we are going to transition to the passing of segregation laws. For this section, we're going to be analyzing segregation laws. You need to access this particular file, and then you want to think about the questions that are here as you work in your groups. I have provided the text for the 14th Amendment because the 13th is about freeing the slaves and the 15th is about voting rights. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to read this state law of Louisiana, and we're going to try to figure out a loophole around this particular piece of legislation. And we also want to take note of the requirements here. What I mean by requirements, you are not allowed to sell tickets in one ticket booth. If you are the circus owner, you are going to be required to provide separate booths for people of different races, and they have to be, for some reason, 25 feet apart. I don't know exactly why, but keep in mind, if you are the circus owner and you do not do this, you could potentially find yourself open for litigation if somebody decides to challenge and argue that you are not following the state law. In your notes, you want to recreate this chart here. We're going to look at some segregation laws. The goal is not to advocate for these laws. The goal is to understand the role of loopholes that will be used from segregation up to the civil rights movement, or that L+S versus F that we've been talking so much about. We want to determine the possible arguments regarding case number 1 involves a sick patient who is in a hospital room on his bed near death, and the situation is this: a white female nurse was asked to take care of the near-death black male in the hospital who was given her this order. The administrative staff of the hospital, and the question here is who's right or who's wrong, what loopholes will be used, who is breaking the law, who is not breaking the law. Transitioning to another scenario which involves North Carolina, and the scenario is that a school administrator has decided to give books from a white school to a black school, which prompted this individual as a taxpayer to argue that there is a violation of the law because the law states that this cannot happen. We'll then move on to this scenario, which involves a prison warden who is placing white prisoners in a cell with black prisoners. Here we have the plaintiff who is arguing that the warden did not follow the state law, and we need to figure out who is right, who is wrong, What are the loopholes in this particular scenario? Then we transition to this one. This one involves amateur baseball. For some reason in the state of Georgia, you cannot play baseball unless you have a 2-block buffer. We have block 1, block 2. We have a developer who is going to buy this land, which forces the black field here, which possibly makes them in violation of the law because they are now 1.5 blocks within range of this white field. This individual is trying to play baseball, and he cannot do so because he is so bothered to play baseball in such close proximity to the black players who are playing on that field. Here we have yet another scenario. In this situation, we have a barbershop owner who has given the barber an order to cut the hair of this woman, this customer. Who is in the right, who is in the wrong? Keep in mind we have two cases here because plaintiff 1 is arguing that he is not allowed to cut the hair, whereas plaintiff 2 is upset that he actually cut the hair. How would this get resolved in the courts of the South? Last task we're going to do is look at restaurant floor plans, state of Alabama. And what you're going to do is try to figure out how you would integrate this particular restaurant or comply with this law, which is requiring you to have a separate solid partition. Now, what you want to do is look at this particular image and determine whether or not it's equal. And I'm going to say no, it has a cost of $10,000. We then move on to this one. Is this in compliance? What about this one? And you might want to try to develop your own wall partition to figure out how you can comply with this legislation. That's it. Make sure you have an understanding of these terms here that we have addressed. Make sure that you have completed the AP source framework. We already addressed the loopholes for defendants and plaintiffs. And if you want to check your definitions, feel free to use this slide.